So thank you, Aline. I think it was a very helpful background for the lecture of Mrs. Timuror, that you actually as an not so personally engaged observer kind of gave us the entire, which obviously was in her sort of speech as well, but I mean about the sort of I would almost say ideology or the vocabulary and the main sort of lines of thoughts, how the women's movement was so much influenced, but I'm not was so much influenced from this decolonization movement, and that was a part of this leftist quite radical leftist sort of movement, and that it was so strongly anti-authoritarian, basically. Yeah, and this this sort of this speech or this I don't know. Yeah, this theory helped to actually find new spaces for new power positions for the women, and for this sort of fight for women's emancipation. Whereas it was this emancipation from the bottom up. What Katerina was speaking about was more the sort of emancipation top down. So it was somehow organized by the state, as long as you don't disturb the working of our economy. Your private life is your own thing, you know. Whereas you were saying the private is political. Whereas, the way you were portraying it was that your private life, you're free in your private life as long as you fill the duties the state is until the 1968 at least the state gives you, you know, the framework, as long as yeah. So would you like to maybe react to the others' lectures? I mean, to me in Czechoslovakia, it was not so, there was no 68 movement, or there was this emancipatory movement, but there was this. There was, but not a feminist movement. Yes, that's my question. Yeah, exactly. That was what I was about to say, that there was this emancipation, which you could call decolonization again from the Soviet Union or something.
But I still wouldn't. I wouldn't do that.
What?
The efforts of the 60s in Prague and Czechoslovakia more generally were for more political freedoms. And meaning domestic political freedoms. Really, people wanted to be more able to move, and also economic freedoms, because the economists were devising new programs for less state-driven organization of economy and for introducing of more market elements. So this political and economic part was defining of 1960s and what is known as the Prague Spring, but not, for example, social freedoms, which would include many of those freedoms that we associate with gender emancipation or feminism. So still there was a movement of people, of experts also, towards more liberalization, but not on the front of social rights, because those had been established to the extent that people were fairly satisfied, and especially in comparison to the West, they were stronger, right? So people did not clamor for those rights during the Prague Spring, but they did clamor for political liberties, freedom of association, the classical ones, and of course the economic freeing of society. Yeah, those did not materialize, none of those.
Ich hätte eine Frage, oder vielleicht auch, ist es Anja? Ne? Ja. Also wir haben jetzt also wir haben ja Meilensteine genannt, aber es sind jetzt zwei Schlaglichter, obwohl man eigentlich sagen kann, sie sind irgendwie auch Meilensteine, weil sie eben sehr viel repräsentieren, denke ich, auch in einem Diskurs. Und ich finde das jetzt mit dem Befreiungsbegriff nochmal ganz interessant, weil im Westen, wenn man es jetzt mal sagen, ist ja der Befreiungsbegriff, der hat ja vor allem in der Zeit sofort irgendwie etwas Subversives, weil man hat sich da solidarisiert mit dem Kampf um Freiheit der Völker im Süden und so weiter. Und im Osten war ja also mit den Brüdervölkern und so weiter, war ja dieser Befreiungsbegriff erstmal schon so staatlich besetzt. Also der hat ja, würde ich jetzt mal sagen, wenn man jetzt irgendwie subversiv sein wollte im Osten und man hat jetzt von der Befreiung in dem Sinne gesprochen, dann so liefen auch irgendwie die FDJ-Verbände durch die Straße und haben von der Befreiung und der Solidarität mit den Brüdervölkern oder so gesprochen. Also ja, genau. Also es hat nicht so funktioniert. Also als der Begriff hat halt unterschiedlich funktioniert in beiden Sphären. Und jetzt ist es ähnlich, denke ich, mit dem, wie du auch gerade sagtest, mit den Frauenrechten. Die waren ja auch irgendwie so staatlich vereinnahmt. Das wurde irgendwie alles geregelt. Es hat ja jetzt auch nicht dazu gedient, wenn man jetzt sich für die politische Freiheit einsetzen wollte, hat man es, denke ich, nicht sehr gut über die Frauenrechte tun können, weil die waren irgendwie schon so staatlich gekapert. Jetzt wäre meine Frage nach 68, also nach dem Prager Frühling, war ja so auch aus dem Abstract, den du uns geschickt hast und wo wir drüber gelesen hatten, über deine Arbeit, war ja irgendwie so ein Backlash. Plötzlich hat der Staat sich wieder so ein bisschen zurückgezogen von solchen in dem Bereich sehr liberalen Positionen. Wurde dann irgendwie auch die Frauenbewegung plötzlich subversiv? Konnte sie dann irgendwie subversiv werden?
I wouldn't say that there was a women's movement really in the sense that we understand the women's movement to be at any point during state socialism. That is not to say that there were not active women. There were. So there were women associated with Československý svaz žen, Czechoslovak Union of Women, which was a kind of under the umbrella of Communist Party, so to speak. And there have been many misconceptions about this organization. Namely, they have been in the Czech Republic nowadays associated with this, like Soudružka Kabrhelová, the comrade Kabrhelová, the very ugly female politician of the late 80s, who was exactly the stereotype of a feminist. And I'm saying a feminist because that stereotype is just undying. But her association, this women's union, have been doing many things for women locally. And they were also at the table when there were things being discussed on the governmental level, which related to women and the youth. And as I was going through governmental materials, most of the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, these women from the union were there, and they were always unfailingly fighting for the most liberal position for the women, for the most accessible abortion rights, for example, which was of interest to me. More so than the experts and way more than, say, trade unionists who would have introduced abortion rights were made accessible in 1957 in Czechoslovakia. And, for example, trade unions would have it curtailed if it were up to them. But these women were there at the table kind of insisting that these rights need to be kept for women. So there was not a women's movement as in the street with banners and doing, that was not there for obvious reasons, lack of political liberties. But there were active women, and we can call that also a movement, minus the streets, minus the political support of the masses, plus the ridicule of pretty much everybody. But they did very important work, and they also connected with experts, and that historiography is being done now. What these women were actually doing locally, what all they were. So the movement works really differently in the socialist context, and so I would want to put it in like brackets. It was not like the movement as is readily understood now, the Western concept of the movement.
Is it maybe that the term sort of woman was actually so ideologically strongly misused also by those like state socialism? Because I remember everybody had to celebrate like the Women's Day, you know, and everybody hated it like in the end because it was like so state dominated.
I guess people hated the state because they associated with communism. But, for example, International Women's Day has been experiencing revivals for the at least last 15 years, which is taken over by feminists, like what you understand, like movement feminists nowadays. And of course, the communist state managed to ruin many things for people, at least the idea of those things. But at the same time, people did not have to think about certain rights and took them for granted. And that was also the case for Czechoslovak and other Eastern women after the regime changed. They did not understand the Western feminists who were coming and saying, you need to fight for your rights. Like, what I have my rights. Why would I need to fight for
But
that?
Katharina, it wasn't, in the beginning, in the 50s, it wasn't about women's rights. It was women in the labor market. Women, we need
It
women.
was about women's rights. I would disagree with you. It was about women's rights.
It's my question. Because coming from, I have a GDR background, and looking at the 50s in the GDR, it was not about women's rights. It was women have. We need women in the market.
No,
we need women like workers, and then for this reason, it was not about emancipation. No.
Oh yes, it was. No, I really disagree with you there. Socialism needed women in the work space.
In the workspace,
I wouldn't call that market.
Workspace,
but also, it was only socialism in Czechoslovakia, and I believe it would be similar in the GDR context, that granted women the same rights as men in the family. Because, like, I don't know, you Czechs present in this room.
But it was
when
not
did you?
with the words
Let me
of-
finish.
yeah.
When did you think that women were equalized within the family with men? In 1950. Like the whole interwar Czechoslovak Republic was marked by endless discussions in the parliament about equalizing the status of women and children within the family. Never happened. Communists came to power, and of course, because they are communists, because they were authoritarian, within a year and a half, there was a new family code which equalized the status of women, meaning they had the right to decide over themselves and over the children to the extent that men do. Also, when abortion rights were introduced in 1957, it was among experts who were heavily influencing those debates. It was absolutely framed as the right of the woman to decide over her reproductive capacities. How is that not about the rights of women? I don't know.
Yeah, but that's not framed in this with these words, with this kind
But
of
it is. I'm just
emphasis.
telling you, it is. It is. It is. And the words emancipation and equality were used through and through and through. It was not really, it was not just let's push, because like in Czechoslovakia, for example, GDR the same, or for future GDR at that point, women actually worked, more so than in Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. So it was not about pushing women into the labor. They had already been there to a fairly large extent. It was more about introducing a new vision of the citizen and granting those rights, and that's what the socialist state did.
Could as well be different in Czechoslovakia and in the GDR. Maybe there's a difference because it's another
When you look at
development
the
of the
early
state.
earlier years, in the early 50s, it was really a huge effort to convince women to leave the families, to convince. They struggled really with this German mother kind of mother image, and it was really a huge effort made by convincing women to go to work also. And
Germany would have the history very recent at that point of Third Reich, right, with the idealized motherhood, and that would be, I assume, vastly different than what we were dealing with in Czechoslovakia after the war.
With the war, it also brought the women naturally to the places because they had to step up for the men who were at the war front. So they were suddenly doing all of these jobs, right? That
Always happened after the war,
men
yeah.
were doing. So they somehow, even though I read that after the First World War, as soon as the men came back, the women that were then again suppressed.
Yeah.
If I can, I think that we should not forget that history did not start in 1950s. The first thing what actually the communist regime did after 1948 was destroying and denying everything what concerned feminism during the 1920s and 30s. One of the most important interwar feminists, Milada Horáková, was assassinated in the political processes in the 1950s. So I think that we really should understand what emancipation and feminism really meant, because they wanted to do everything possible just to deny any trace of the so-called bourgeois feminism from the pre-war era. And the second thing which I want to say about abortions is definitely true that abortion was maybe fought for by the women's organization during communism. But as a person who was growing up in 1970s and 80s, I do remember that abortion was allowed, but you had to go to a special abortion committee to get an allowance to actually go to the abortion. So, and since actually there was no access to any kind of how do you say, anticonception, the birth control. I mean, basically, abortion was the way of birth control for many young women. So we should really kind of put this into the proper context. But of course, you know, I'm not an expert in what Katerina is, but I just want to say something what definitely was a little bit different or maybe more complicated, just to maybe raise more questions.
I have to react to this, what Martina is just saying, and I know that this is exactly the image of socialism that Czechs have, and I'm not saying that communists have not committed horrible things. I'm just saying that we have to give them credit for something that they have accomplished. With abortion, actually, it is an interesting thing. These commissions that you speak about were abolished in 1986. But they never, for example, existed in Poland, right? So Catholic Poland never had these commissions, and women in Poland could get abortions very freely. That made Polish people very angry, because the church had always been very strong there, and church was, of course, very much against it. But the Polish communist state was very much pushing for abortion to be very, very accessible as exactly a symbolic matter, which went against what people thought. And now this is a very thin ice, but hear me out. Maybe, just maybe, we need to not go for the most radical thing, like abortion for everybody anytime, but like to kind of tune it down for the right to persevere a possible change of regime or, you know, the future. In Poland, the abortion was the first right to be curtailed after communists lost power, because it was so strongly associated with them bad communists, and the church and the Solidarność won over communism, that Poles were actually really angry, and abortion is nowadays almost not accessible in Poland. And interestingly, as Alena Wagnerová, who some of you might know, she lives in Germany and she is a Czech researcher. She was doing this research on women's situation in Czechoslovakia already in the 70s, and her book was published in German in 1977, I believe, or 4 or 7. And she was actually showing from the contemporaneous research that women were actually satisfied with the access to abortion. They were not satisfied with other things. They were not satisfied with how much housework they had to do. They complained about that endlessly. But with abortion access, they were satisfied. And according to the governmental materials, actually 95% of women who applied for abortion got the abortion. I am not saying that it was a joy to go in front of that commission. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it was easy. But I'm saying it was possible, very possible for somebody who wants to get abortion. Also, it's not true that abortion was the only form of contraception. There were, of course, in a limited fashion, other forms accessible, mostly intrauterine device that by the 80s became the most prevalent among women, and then the pill was only after that, out of these modern, so-called modern forms of contraception. So it is actually more layered than that.
Maybe now, there's one more. Maybe I would allow one more question, and then we would need to move on to the other table talk. Yeah, I think so, because we need to. 5 to 10 more minutes. Yeah, of course.
I would like to say thank you to this kind of research you are doing, because I really appreciate it, because I think it's really necessary to open the discussion in Czech Republic about the socialism, and to make it more colorful and more really I don't know how to say it, not too anti-communist. I mean, because there is really the main approach to this is still anti-communist, and for me it's also more interesting and more complex, the whole topic of emancipation during communism. And I have a question because I did a research for my radio documentary about feminism in about gender policy in Czechoslovakia and Austria in 60s and 70s. I made a lot of interviews with immigrants because for me it was really interesting that they have this both perspectives. And it was interesting that Czechoslovak immigrants, for these women are really hard to speak about emancipation because they were emancipated also before. Just maybe for them who came to Austria during this wave in '68, it was a big difference because they came to the history. You know, they came to the country where they didn't have any rights. Their husband was the head of the family. They didn't have any possibility to go to work without his permission and to move without his permission and so on. So it was a shock. And I was thinking, I was making also then the research about the situation in Czechoslovakia, and then I went through your text, and I was wondering, because you wrote in some researches that there were some books also, some the sexological books about relationships published in 50s, and they were really, really interesting, but then they disappeared, and I was thinking about the censorship, if you are also dealing with this topic the censorship of normalization, it means after in 70s and 80s, because it was quite huge. Also activity of the state. If you have some information about it, where they are, the book, because I think the book, the second sex by Beauvoir, it's still everywhere in antiquariat. So in every family there was some. There was one. What is really also strange because it was any impact of the books to the society. It was also an interesting question. But these books from 50s, they are missing. So where they are now?
To your first part, to your research, that sounds really exciting. And I remember I mentioned already Alena Wagnerová. And again, some of you Czechs and maybe Germans know Gerlinda Schmaus, who also Czech-German, was in Saarbrücken and then came back to Brno. And they both had the same recollection of emigres in 1968 from Czechoslovakia to West Germany. And they were saying, essentially, as a citizen, I felt freer in West Germany, but as a woman, I felt freer in Czechoslovakia. And exactly the same experiences with husband co-signing their employment, not being able to open a bank account because without husband's signature. It was just mind-blowing for them. So there is also a case of how quickly we as people, women included, take our rights as granted, right? That that doesn't even occur to us that it can be otherwise. Then, of course, I sign my own work contract, right? And to your other question, I did not encounter these books from the 50s disappearing as much as the authors really changed their mind because, as I said at the beginning, these sexologists, they operated in Czechoslovakia without an interruption, which cannot be said about sociologists, philosophers, psychologists. Those were banned, labeled bourgeois, disbanded, and then they rebanded again. But these sexologists, they were medical doctors, and the state realized that they needed medical doctors. So they operated without an interruption. So it's fairly easy to follow what they were thinking and doing and writing. And they really got muted, but they still existed and they changed their views and the new ones came to the fore with very different kinds of views. And they still published books, marriage manuals that were authored by sexologists from the Institute in the 70s. I wasn't quoting from these here, but they're in my book and they're horrible. They're horrible. And then, of course, Plzák came to the fore in the mid-70s. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the reaction, and the horrible for the non-Czechs here. Very hierarchical idea of marriage, very kind of pragmatic in that forget love. This serves the purpose. The purpose is reproduction, bringing up children. Shut up and do it. So it was very popular, and his books, Plzák's books, were being published in Czech Republic until 2010, I think. So really, long this persevered this view of marriage as a hierarchical where everybody has their roles, the roles exactly as you would imagine, feminine and masculine, in upbringing, in daily life, and sex is just a thing that serves the purpose of like keeping mostly men satisfied and at home, but nothing beyond that. Of course, reproduction, but after that's done, the sex should be kept because that just kind of greases the wheels or something. A very pragmatic view, very typical of the times.
Yeah. So one last question, and then I would have one question, if I may.
You said about the homosexual man, but I was wondering, what was like with the homosexual woman?
Nothing terribly interesting, I hate to disappoint you, because the law did not prohibit female homosexuality. They were not a target the way men were, and sexologists did not exhibit much interest in female homosexuals. And as I was studying their materials, because they were like, they themselves said that they typically encounter people who come to their medical office who are dissatisfied or who have a problem. And female homosexuals did not have a problem, nor were they dissatisfied. So naturally, they did not occur in sex offices. And in a couple of rare instances when they came into focus was when there was other problems connected, typically prostitution or incarceration. But there were already like very different contexts, and as I said, it wasn't very frequent. The topic of male sexual deviance was much more heavily discussed than that of female sexual deviance, including potentially female homosexuality. But again, it was not a focus. Right?
Ja, dann vielleicht jetzt noch, darf ich noch eine letzte Frage? Wir sind ein bisschen über die Zeit. Ich denke, wir machen, das ist aber eigentlich auch okay, wir machen dann einfach eine Viertelstunde Pause, wie vorgesehen, und haben dann nochmal eine Stunde für den zweiten Table, eine knappe. Ich will nur ganz kurz zwei Sachen sagen. Also einmal vielen Dank für diesen differenzierten Blick auch auf den Osten. Es ist ja immer so der Osten. Manchmal denke ich mir, wie kann man das sagen? Wir machen jetzt einen Vortrag über Ost und einen über West, aber ich denke, ja, es ist halt dann plakativ in dem Moment, aber es kommt dann ja gleich wieder die starke Differenzierung. Was ich auch noch interessant fand, war jetzt der Einwurf, dass es ja hier auch so eine Verurteilung als bourgeoises Gedankengut gab. Ich meine, da haben wir jetzt auch, denke ich, wieder Parallelen zum Modernismus und auch mal wieder zum Bauhaus, um das Wort mal zwischendrin wieder zu sagen, dass ja auch zum Beispiel in der DDR erstmal unter diesem Bourgeoisie-Verdacht stand. Eine letzte Frage, weil wir jetzt beim zweiten Workshop-Talk ja dann in die räumliche Konstruktion einsteigen werden. Vielleicht nochmal abschließend was zu den regionalen Unterschieden. Wir haben ja jetzt die unterschiedlichen Betrachtungen, Begriffsverwendungen gesehen oder gehört. Jetzt vielleicht hatten wir ja auch diese Frage uns überlegt, gibt es heute noch jetzt in der hoffentlich überwundenen Ost-West-Geografie stereotypischen signifikante Unterschiede, also in Bezug auf, wir hatten in der Zwischenkriegszeit zwei unterschiedliche Verfassungsentwürfe. In der Tschechoslowakei war sie etwas progressiver formuliert, würde ich sagen, als in der Weimarer Fassung, die Gleichstellung. Noch vielleicht ganz kurz, heutige signifikante Unterschiede, oder sind wir quasi jetzt über die Ost-West-Geografie hinaus bei der Entwicklung?
You mean in this like question of like female sort of rights and what does like
and
emancipation now have to fight for, and if there is like some difference?
The societal reality. So do we have? I mean, we're still arguing here about abortion in Germany, you know, again and again and again. Now we have this advertisement problem, and do we have any significant differences now on those high topics at the moment, out of your experience?
Well, maybe you can also speak about this.
I was just going to say, with women's issues, it can be country by country, because you have obviously Poland, right, which kind of fucks it up for everybody. But then the issue which still remains clearly East-West defined is homosexual rights in no ex-socialist country do you have full marital rights for homosexuals. In fact, there are several countries which put it into their constitution that the marriage is between a man and a woman. So we are still waiting for full marriage rights for same-sex couples. And that is very much East-West line, which is very much alive. So, okay, there are various registered partnerships, such as the Czech Republic has, but that discriminate on the basis of childcare, typically. So that remains the case.
I think.
Yeah, there are several issues, and it differs country by country. So people who are crazily enough in the Czech Republic, if you are a single person, you can adopt a child. If you are registered in a same-sex partnership, you cannot. Mind-blowing. Yeah. So I wonder which country of the East will be the first. Czech Republic, Slovenia. Somebody else will beat us to it, and it's really. But it's interesting. Like 30 years later,
we accept bets.
And I think what's a very current topic in Germany, which does not so much appear in Czech or in the East, is like this migration and this like Islamic sort of man or whatever, because there is like a large Turkish community in Germany and this like migration background and the different like conceptions of femininity. That doesn't happen so much because, as you probably know, like the sort of that's still like a divide. The Eastern European countries said we don't want any migrants, sadly. So, yeah.
But you don't have this argument of that women's rights are instrumentalized for getting them out?
No. Well, not. I mean that could be like a line of populist argumentation. Like you mean the migrants like threatening our women or something?
This kind of argument you don't have in Czech.
Well, the experience is not so direct. So
maybe they don't have to use the argument, you know, the populists, but they would use it probably if they had migrants.
I mean, it's like when somebody tells it will be on the table, but I mean, what's the like? Yeah, I mean, it's now like threatening the Czech culture, sort of, and it's a Christian culture, and yeah, we don't accept any other cultures, right?
But still, if I can, just one sentence. Even though the problem does not exist, maybe yet, or it will never exist, the far right-wing parties in the Czech Republic do use the same arguments as the far right-wing countries in the West. So it exists no matter that we are not in danger, so to speak. Yeah.
They argue against gender ideology. That's kind of a unison. Gender ideology is a horrible thing everywhere. Yeah, genderism, gender ideology. That's a bad thing.
That's the new universalism.
Absolutely, that crosses the borders.
So thank you for these interesting discussions. I learned a lot again. And then we would have a short break of 10 minutes, and then we have one more impulse talk by Petra Hlaváčková on the feminist urban planning, and we have two guests joining, which is Mrs. Gudrun Sack and Mrs. Sarah Rivière. Right. Okay, thank you.